On October 7th, something darker than a massacre was unleashed. A calculated assault on the most sacred target, the family unit. As Israel widens operations in Gaza and Washington deliberates over the day after, a new report recalls and reframes the atrocious crimes against humanity committed on October 7th. In fact, it suggests the recognition of a new crime under international law, Kinocide. I'm Aylana Meisel and Dr, Executive Director of the Israel Law and Liberty Forum, and this is Basic Law. Today, Dr. Ilya Rudyak, criminal and international humanitarian law scholar, non-resident senior fellow at Penn Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, and former head of research at the Civil Commission on October 7th crimes against women and children, joins us to unpack the case. Why don't existing frameworks like genocide and war crimes fully capture what happened? What would recognizing Kinocide mean for justice, accountability, and the future of international law? Welcome, Dr. Rudyak.
Thank you, Aylana, for this very kind introduction. It's an honor to be here and speak with you about this important topic of genocide.
Thank you for joining us. So, your report proposes this new international law crime, Kinocide. What exactly is it, and how would it specifically differ from existing crimes like genocide or other crimes against humanity?
Thank you. Yes, I'll get to it immediately. I want to mention at the beginning that although I was head of research at the Civil Commission while writing the Kinocide report, I'm presently not working at the commission and interviewing in my personal capacity. I also want to mention that this report was truly a team effort. I had the privilege to write it together with Dr. Cochav Elkayam-Levy, the founder and chair of the commission and an expert in international law, human rights, and feminist theories, as well as Dr. Michal Gilad, who's an interdisciplinary scholar with a background in law and social science and an expert on the rights of children. Also, many other members of the team who are not authors on the report contributed to the report immensely, especially Advocate Irit Gazi, Advocate Eleanor Proitoru, and Advocate Mirav Israeli Amarant. Finally, I want to mention with gratitude that we worked in close collaboration with the Raoul Wallenberg Center, headed by Professor Irvin Cotler, the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. Now, to your question, genocide is a specific form of attack against families. And the term is a combination of the prefix kin, which means family or relative, with the suffix size, which denotes a form of targeted destruction. Essence of genocide is the exploitation of the fundamental bonds between family members in a manner that exacerbates their harm and suffering. For instance, by killing, injuring, or otherwise abusing family members in front of each other. Now, this may seem a bit abstract, so I will briefly tell you the stories of two families, the Idan family and the Eliakim Arba family, that illustrate what is genocide. On the morning of October 7th, terrorists invaded the Idan's family home in Kibbutz Nahal Oz. As the family tried to hide in their safe room, the terrorists shot and killed the family's oldest daughter, Maayan, age 18, in front of her father, Tzachi, her mother, Galdi, her 11-year-old sister, Yael, and her 9-year-old brother, Shahal. Surviving members of the family were then forced outside of the safe room at gunpoint as the parents attempted to shield the children with their bodies. The terrorists commandeered the mother's Facebook account and live-streamed the entire ordeal for the family loved ones to witness in real time. The video shows the family members clinging to one another as they are trying to process the death of their daughter and sister, and the children trembling and asking their parents what will happen to them. Eventually, the father Tzachi was forcibly separated from his family and taken hostage into Gaza. The family was left not knowing whether he is dead or alive for months. He was murdered in captivity and his body was finally returned to Israel earlier this year. As for the Arba Eliakim family, domestic partners Dikla and Noam and their children, Tomer, age 17, Dafna, age 15, and Ella, age 8, were hiding where terrorists invaded their home. During the violent invasion, Dikla and the children had to witness Noam being shot in the leg, injured and bleeding. The terrorists held the family at gunpoint as they commandeered Dikla's Facebook account and live-streamed the entire ordeal for the extended family and loved one to bear witness. The terrorists then separated 17-year-old Tomer at gunpoint from his mother and stepsisters, as his father begged the perpetrators to take him instead. Tomer was led outside and forced to aid the perpetrators in luring neighbors out of their safe rooms. The perpetrators then removed the rest of the family from their home and took them hostage. On their way to Gaza, the mother was killed, and Tomer's two stepsisters were forcibly separated from their father. The father was also killed, while the two girls were taken into Gaza on their own. The ordeals of the Idan and Cochav Elkayam families illuminate the unique evil inherent in Kinocide. On October 7, we witnessed Hamas and its collaborators invading the intimate and vulnerable familial spaces, transforming Israeli families' houses, their castles, so to speak, from spheres of inviolability and safety to sites of terror and mortal danger. The perpetrators' conduct exerted enormous pressures on family members, creating situations of harrowing helplessness and compelling them to act under duress out of fear for their loved ones. These situations illustrate and help to distill the unique evil and the perverse transmutations inherent in Kinocide. Its perpetrators prey upon the familial feelings of love, empathy, and selflessness, and cruelly exploit them. Instead of benefiting family members, these very feelings, the best qualities of humanity, are subverted and weaponized to serve the perpetrators' inhumane ends. What is worse, the ordeals of the Idan and Elkayam families were not isolated incidents. As the Civil Commission's team was collecting and analyzing evidence on the crime committed on October 7th, time and again, we encountered videos posted by Hamas and its collaborators showing exactly what they did when they invaded Israeli family homes. These videos, that even just watching them is mostly difficult, show that the perpetrators killed parents, siblings, and grandparents in the presence of each other, that they violently kidnapped families, including infants and young children, from their home and held their hostage, often just moments after they witnessed the murder of their loved ones. That they forcibly separated families, husbands from wives, siblings from each other, and children from parents, both during the attack and, as we came to know later, in captivity. Each of these instances is horrible. As Dr. Elkayam-Levy says, if there is hell, this is what it looks like: someone abusing your loved ones. But when we collected the information about every family member, about every family, a member of which was either murdered or abducted, and put it in a spreadsheet, we were also able to see the bigger picture. Hamas and its collaborators systematically used similar tactics and methods of operation, such as those employed in the Idan and Cochav Elkayam family homes.
The report details 6 consistent patterns of abuse on October 7th. This is obviously extremely difficult to talk about, and we're going to soon move toward more legal questions, but I think it's important to really set the foundation of what we're discussing. Yeah, it made for difficult reading. It makes for somewhat difficult discussion, and I appreciate the viewers and the listeners keeping with us. But could you provide a few examples of these patterns, and explain how they demonstrate a deliberate strategy of targeting families?
As you mentioned, we discovered 6 distinct, systematic, and repetitive patterns of operation that occurred at different places on October 7th by different groups at different times. Okay. And the fact of this repetitiveness and systematicity suggested that these patterns were a deliberate strategy that was deployed. The atrocity committed against families were not a side effect of the overall attack. The family was specifically targeted. Now, the specific patterns that we discovered are many acts of violence, including killing and severe injury in the presence of other family members, eliminating entire family units, abduction and hostage taking of families, including children, using digital media to broadcast abuses directly to victims' families and to the general public, including by commandeering the victims' own social media accounts, intentionally separating families, and burning and vandalizing family homes in a particular manner. These patterns are not mutually exclusive. Several of them can be inflicted on a single family. Recall, for instance, the Idan family, whose daughter was murdered in their presence, and whose ordeal was live-streamed on Facebook, and whose father was separated from the family and taken hostage. Another example for the elimination of entire families, for instance, is the Kedem Simanto family, who were all killed in the safe room of their home in Nir Oz, with victims including Tamar, uh, her husband Yonatan, Johnny, and their 5-year-old twin daughters Shachar and Arbel, and their 2-year-old son Omer. Now, note, we have discovered 6 patterns, and these are the patterns that we were able to identify in Israel. It is entirely possible that there are other patterns that we were not able to identify due to evidentiary problems like the murder of the victims. And it is also entirely possible that in other conflicts around the world, there will be other patterns. In some conflicts, for instance, there could be a pattern that is related to abduction of children and in order to make child soldiers out of them. We've seen that in the conflict in Uganda, for instance. So the 6 patterns that we discovered are specific to Israel. They might happen in other conflicts, but they're not kind of a closed list. What's important is the essential characteristic of Kinocide, whether there was a deliberate exploitation of familial bonds to exacerbate suffering of the families.
Can you explain why it's necessary to create a new legal term to describe this type of atrocity rather than just using established legal frameworks?
First, I want to emphasize that while a new legal frame, Kinocide, is indeed necessary, much of genocidal conduct can be prosecuted through existing frameworks. But there are 2 main reasons why the new legal term is necessary. The one is conceptual, and the other lies in its value for the victims. Conceptually, as I mentioned earlier, genocide refers to a specific and unique kind of evil, which current frameworks do not focus on. Moreover, naming is an important step in recognizing and penalizing a phenomenon. I will give 2 examples from domestic criminal law and international law to illustrate this. On the domestic side, we have the crime of assault and the crime of sexual assault. And while sexual assault can be seen as a subset of a general category of assault, it would be a too high level of generalization. There's great value in using the specific term sexual assault when appropriate, in terms of recognition of the specific crime and stigmatization of the offender. On the international arena, consider the crime of genocide and its relationship to mass murder. There's a difference. Genocide is not just multiple instances of mass murder. Genocide is a certain crime that encompasses a certain intent to exterminate, destroy a group in whole or in part as such. The word genocide gives meaning to those separated instances of killing. This is what Kinocide does with families. Now, on the second front, there's the value of this term for the victims. As we have written this report and shared it with victims, both in Israel and abroad, we discovered that it is helpful for them. It helps them to label what they have experienced. Families told us that this is what happened to us. This is now enables us better articulate what has happened. It's not just killing. It's not just injury. It's genocide. And we heard this not only from Israel. We heard this from members of the Yazidi communities who mentioned that, yes, this is what happened to us.
Well, this is something that you should maybe share with us in a little more depth, because the report does say that genocide obviously is not, in its view, something that was specific to October 7th, but October 7th is what allows for this project to try and give, a shape to this phenomenon. And then you bring up a number of other cases, including the Yazidis. So could you give just a bit more insight into some of the commonalities between these instances?
Well, genocide is, as you correctly said, October 7th was, for us, the trigger to see this phenomenon. Genocide is one of those things that once you see, you cannot unsee. And if you are familiar with atrocities around the world, you suddenly come to realize this has happened in other places. This is not the first time that families were intentionally targeted in the world. So I mentioned before the Yazidi communities, there was a deliberate process by ISIS of separating families, killing predominantly the males, often in front of their partners, and then taking away the women and their children and enslaving them. So this is an example of genocidal conduct in other conflict or other recent conflict. And if you look closely at many cases of mass atrocities, you see this conduct happening again and again because terrorists, armed groups, etc., recognize, they understand quite intuitively the immense terror value of these kind of behaviors. If they want to force, if they want to terrify someone, if they want to compel someone to behave in a certain way, one of the effective ways to do that is to engage in genocide, killing family members in front of each other. It affects the family itself, the family member, and it spreads more widely to people who fear that this will be done to them.
How do you go about integrating a new crime into international criminal law? And what I don't want to go too much into technical details, like, it has to be some relatively 30,000-foot view, but what kind of legal precedents or existing statutes could be interpreted to support this?
In the report, we show essentially 4 avenues through which existing law can be used to prosecute genocidal conduct. So genocide can be prosecuted as a crime against humanity, as a war crime, as a constituent part of genocide, and as a species of torture. I will talk about the legal framework of the Rome Statute, even though this is obviously not the only framework, and there's customary law and there's the laws for, but it's easier, it's quite easier to explain. So on the crimes against humanity framework, one kind of obvious site for incorporating genocide is the prohibition on, it's the residual prohibition on other inhumane acts. And it's a residual to conduct like murder, torture, hostage taking, etc. And this prohibition was used before by courts, international tribunals, to encompass certain kinds of conducts that were not specifically enumerated as crimes against humanity, but they were expanded to include this. So this is on the crimes against humanity front. There's a similar provision in war crimes framework about cruel and inhumane treatment, which again, it's a provision that exists in the Rome Statute, but it also exists in the underlying international humanitarian law that underlies the criminal prohibitions in the Rome Statute. And again, there as well, there is case law showing how incorporating conduct not specifically enumerated in the specific prohibitions. And there is also a case law from Yugoslavia, the Kobercic case, in which the prosecution actually charged the accused in that case for conduct that we now recognize as genocidal, specifically murdering family members in front of the victim's eyes.
So what does it mean to get the crime recognized? What would it look like?
The main value of this, that this is something that can happen tomorrow by a court. A court, an international tribunal, tomorrow can look at a genocidal conduct such as one of the patterns that occurred in Israel, or take a look at the situation, at the ordeal that the Iran family undergone, and say this conduct is a crime against humanity. It should be recognized under the provision of other inhumane acts. It is similar enough to other inhumane acts, and it should be prosecuted and punished as such. So this is a simple interpretational exercise. Now, not a very expensive one. It's a very kind of straightforward.
And if that were to happen, what would it mean to prosecute this crime? What would that look like?
First, if it happens through judicial recognition, prosecuting this crime would have to address the elements of the crime that the judicial ruling will enunciate. This is kind of a, let's say, bottom-up way of prosecuting this. So a court recognizes a particular crime, and then prosecutors around the world are using this and prosecuting it accordingly. I think, in a sense, it would be no different from any other international crime. So Kinocide is unique in many ways in its content, but in the way of how its prosecution would be conducted, it can be quite straightforward, just as any other international crime, with the same evidentiary standards, with similar kind of processes.
On that note, before the show, I'd kind of asked you the flip question, which is, I think that people who identify themselves, as many of our broader legal community do, as more conservative or classical liberal, or even if it's not, a global definition, at least as far as the way they see legal and governance questions, are somewhat suspicious of generating like new crimes and new rights, both because what you end up doing in the end, certainly the rights discourse, is basically taking away the significance of what there is consensus on that needs to be protected. And then secondly, in the realm of international law specifically, we've seen so many ideas perverted and misused to fulfill political agendas, that one could look at the report and say, it points to a real problem. It's absolutely true. It's absolutely tragic. But why does it necessitate this new legal category? Aren't there costs? What do you say?
Well, I'll start with that. I'm very sympathetic to this view. This is my personal view on international law. The proliferation of rights is not necessarily a virtue, and it's not necessarily a benefit, and it often entails cost. So this should be acknowledged. I do make a special pleading here for Kinocide, because it's so different, because it captures something that is quite unique. Usually, specific international crimes focus on the individual. What was done to this or that person? The category of genocide is different, and it actually looks at a protected group, a large protected group. Kinocide is on the same continuum, much closer to the individual. It focuses on the most fundamental, most basic unit of society, the family. There is no such prohibition in international law that focuses on this unit of analysis. So it's the unique evil of Kinocide, and the unique focus of this conduct that requires this new name. This, alongside the benefits of labeling, which I mentioned before, both for stigmatization and prosecution, and for the value for the victims.
Okay. You had mentioned that you thought it was very important to discuss what kinocide is not, because obviously, it's something that seems to overlap with a lot of other things that do exist, and it's quite hard, I would imagine, to commit a genocide, God forbid, without, regardless, inflicting the kind of harms that you would see in this idea of kinocide. So what is the delineating factor? What is it? What is it not? Right? Israel is currently being accused of genocide on the world stage. I'm perfectly comfortable saying there is no genocide happening, right? A lot of people believe that there is. What would you say in terms of that way of deciding that something is or isn't happening?
So it is indeed crucial to understand what kinocide is and what it is not. Kinocide is the deliberate targeted assault on families, and it is fundamentally different from other forms of suffering that families endure during war. Consider, for example, the cases of collateral damage to civilians, which occurred as a side effect of a lawful attack on a military target, let's say by an airstrike. Now, in many cases, the harmed civilians will have families, and the harm befalling them would cause immense suffering to the family. This is not to be minimized, but these are not cases of kinocide, because they do not involve the intentional targeting of families, and they are not characterized by the exploitation of familial bonds. Again, it is not to diminish in any way the tragic consequences of war that these families, hurt by other calamities of war, experience. But this is not genocide.
And what would the punishment be?
It depends on how you estimate the gravity of the act. You could look at it as an aggravation, for instance. So a case of murder with an aggravation of being done in the presence of another. You can look at it as a separate, independent crime that would be charged separately, and the sentence could be consecutive or not. I have my views on that. I do think it should be an independent crime, just because it's aggravation on other acts not exactly captures what I think is essential in kinocide. But reasonable people can disagree on that.
So what would you say the next steps are for, you said earlier that in theory, this crime of kinocide could be recognized by a court tomorrow, and then it would exist. But clearly there's some attempt, the report's been released. You and Erwin Kotler and Dr. Elkayam have written at least a few articles on articles of war, I imagine elsewhere as well. So what does it look like to try and advance the recognition? I know you're no longer on the Civil Commission, your views are your own, and yet I will ask the question of where this seems to be leading.
Yeah. So next steps, as always, in international law, processes tend to be glacial. So it takes time. And the first step is almost always dissemination and coalition building, which is part of what we're doing here. We're telling the world about this crime. And we're trying to, by the way, just kind of moving a bit from the legal question, the very act of telling the world about this crime. If a victim of a conflict in another country hears about kinocide and has this aha moment, this is what was done to me, we have already achieved a lot, regardless of whether the international legal system would adopt kinocide as a crime or not. So this is one. The very act of disseminating this information and talking about kinocide is already helpful, if not necessarily in a legal sense, but in a human sense. It can also be helpful in a legal sense because pressure from victim communities, coalitions of victim communities, coalition of scholars that hear about this concept and want to advance it further. This is kind of the first steps to go. Another route is to use it in legal proceedings, and we're actually doing this already. The Civil Commission is doing this already. The term Kinocide is being used in legal proceedings in Israel. We were approached by the Ministry of Justice Legal Defense team representing some of the victims of October 7th, and they are right now using the term Kinocide in legal proceedings. So recognition through domestic courts can be another avenue of progressing. Also, and this is on the domestic side, well, the international processes are glacial and require a lot of kind of coalition building and consensus among countries. Genocide could be promoted on the national level. And in fact, it might be one of the most effective ways to advance the crime of genocide. Countries like Israel, but not only, could codify the crime of genocide into their criminal code. They could also have it as part of their military code, just to kind of extend and increase awareness of what is prohibited. And through state practice, which is one of the movers of international law, state practice can be a very valuable, both on its own and as a vehicle to move international law forward to recognizing genocide. Now, there's a lot of room for academics and practitioners of international criminal law to come together, and the Commission is trying to convene this convention of coming together of scholars and practitioners to discuss the topic of genocide and to try to find some sort of definition that would incorporate many viewpoints and would be informed by the many experiences of people around the world in different conflicts. Because, as I mentioned, we have found 6 patterns. I am nearly certain that there are more, and such conferences could clarify what is genocide and how to define it in the best possible way. So there's a lot to do, and not everything requires, the Kinocide Convention to be ratified tomorrow. But there is this way as well. There is a way of building a coalition around writing the Kinocide Convention, or entering or kind of including the crime of genocide into, right now there's a draft of the convention that tries to codify crimes against humanity. And genocide could be one of the subsections. So there's a lot of legal avenues to pursue. But first of all, dissemination, coalition building.
So, Dr. Rudyak, I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today and to explain this idea and how you believe that its codification will help not even just the victims of October 7th, but of many other communities as well. I look forward to seeing how it develops. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me and for allowing me to talk about this important subject. I really appreciate it.